Hello, welcome to my channel. In this video, we are starting with 3D user interface input hardware. Now, when we talk about this VR, AR and VR, the 3D user interface is very important. And when we try to interact with this 3D user interface, the input hardware becomes a very important thing. In this video series, we will be discussing various different types of inputs hardwares which are available and the key characteristics and selection of this input hardware. Now coming to our first point, before going into the different types of hardware, first we need to understand what are the characteristics of input devices. So there are four characteristics of input devices. So first is the degrees of freedom that an input device can afford. So in simple words, degrees of freedom is independent way by which a body or a object can be moved in the space. Okay, so a degree of freedom generally will a device or a tracker will be having 3 degrees of freedom in terms of position, that is XYZ, and 3 degrees of freedom in terms of orientation, that is about X, about Y, and about Z. So in total, it will have a 6 degrees of freedom. Now, a device which is having more degrees of freedom is definitely a complex device to handle, and it has more power in accommodating various interaction techniques with the environment. So this is first, that is degrees of freedom. Second characteristics is by the input type and frequency of the data or the reports that they are generating. Now, the input devices are either a discrete component, a continuous component, or a combination of two. So when we say it is a discrete input device, it is basically generating a single data value like a boolean, 0 or 1, yes or no, true and false, or any specific element from a set. Now these discrete signals are basically used, if I can give an example, it is basically used to switch between sketch environment to the 3D environment, or 3D environment to the sketch when we talk about the modeling softwares, or click of a cursor is basically a single value. Okay, when we talk about continuous input device components, it is generally generates a multiple data values. Okay, in many cases, regardless of what the user is doing, still your system is tracking the location of your device or location of your specific movement. So that is basically a continuous device. So in many cases, input devices can be a combination of discrete and continuous, which will have its own benefits, providing a larger range of device to interaction technique mappings. So this is your second characteristic which we are looking at into the input devices. The third one is how much input, how much physical interaction is required to use that device for a user. In this category, you can divide devices into two types, that is purely active devices and purely passive devices. Examples: purely active devices will have clicks, buttons, and purely passive devices are basically trackers. Now these purely active devices will generate a discrete and continuous signal, whereas purely passive devices will generate the continuous signal. Now what do we understand from this? The purely active devices will not provide any information if you are not handling it, whereas the purely passive devices will always give the input to the system whether it is physically handled or it is not handled. It will be continuously tracking the location. That is the role of tracker. Okay. Now, when we talk about 3D user interfaces, when we try to interact with the environment, it is always better to have a purely passive device which is continuously interacting and giving me the update on the location. So that is another point for the 3D user interfaces. The last one is categorized by their intended use. How you are planning to use a specific device. Now, there are independent ways that body in space is basically moving. A device such as tracker generally captures three position values and three orientation values for that basically gives you the total 6 degrees of freedom. Now, the specific devices are designed to determine position or orientation information. Those are called locators. Some devices will be designed to produce a real number value. Those are called valuators. And few devices are to indicate the particular element of a set, that is basically giving the choice. Another type of input devices will have a measurement relative, whether it's a relative or absolute type of measurement. All these types or categories will come under how you want to use that specific devices. Either it will be based on degrees of freedom, it will be based on the function, that is locators, valuators, or choice, or maybe with the type by which the device relate or measures the value, that is relative or an absolute. Okay, so these are the four major input characteristics, input device characteristics, which we are looking at when we talk about selection of your input hardware. That's all about this video. In coming videos, we will be discussing different types of input hardwares. So if you like this content, do subscribe my channel and keep following this playlist. Thank you for joining.